I'd love to welcome and look forward to welcoming Cynthia to our call. I met Cynthia first time a couple of months ago now, and I had the honour to give my introduction first when on the call, and I was boasting about how having set up E2W 25 years ago and been a proud supporter of gender equality, how I felt that I had got a load of empathy and understanding to the female lived experience, and how that had been enhanced through the launch of Men for Inclusion, etc., etc. And Cynthia stopped me in my tracks and said, "Mark, you can't possibly understand." Because I've swapped my men's black lace ups for a pair of high heels, and I now really understand the difference and the challenges, the differences between the genders and the challenges that women face. And I thought, yeah, you probably do, Cynthia. You probably, you understand a lot better than I do. So welcome to the
Thank
call,
you.
Cynthia. Do
Thank
you want
you.
to do your
Yeah.
introduction,
Sure.
and then we can go from there? But hey, because there's only a few people on the call, let's make this
Yes,
interactive as well.
absolutely.
So
So, what I'd love to do is, as a way of introduction, um, I'm going to read 10 facts because just like the Google's I Am Remarkable program, which I'm a certified mentor for, you know, facts aren't debatable because they just simply are that. They're facts. And so, as a way of introducing a bit about me, is I was Belfast born but Canadian raised, hence this accent. I have over 30 years of corporate business experience. I was a C-suite technology executive. I'm a multi-award winning executive. I have been fortunate to work with almost 500 organizations in 30 countries doing this work that I'm so driven to do today as CAF services. I became a woman with a trans history at the age of 50. I was married for 32 years. I do have 2 adult children. And I actually learned to fight for women's rights before I ever learned to fight for LGBTQ plus or trans rights as the national board leader for Women's March Canada. And today I proudly serve on the board of Outright International based in New York City, who not only are an international LGBTIQ human rights organization, but they're also the Secretariat for the United Nations on all LGBTIQ issues. So the question for the audience, and please feel free to unmute, shout it out, whatever you're comfortable with. Which one of those 10 facts stands out for you?
Think for me, it is the fact that you stood up for women's rights first before any of the others.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Nishi on that point. Kind of maybe that was the starting point for you, and now kind of diversity in all of its forms on your gender.
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia, what was the motivator?
For which part?
For standing up for women's rights before any of the others.
They asked me to, and it was the first part of the education that I had to learn. In fact, one of the very first questions that I ever had in therapy. So I had 6 years of therapy, at least 1 hour every week for over 6 years through this journey. And after kind of the initial blurting everything out to the therapist and starting the conversation, the first question she asked me was, "Are you a feminist?" And that began our very first therapy related discussion, was understanding, exploring, and me gaining the understanding of what it actually meant to be a feminist at that point. And from that, it just made common sense the rest of the journey until I was invited onto the board and eventually asked to be the board chair, leading the organization nationally, which meant I had to learn to fight for all women's rights across Canada, not just the rights that I understood or were directly impacted by, but all women's rights, which meant there was a lot of topics I had to get very comfortable and familiar with that were not my own lived experience, such as menstruation, such as pregnancy. Yet I supported the beliefs of all women have their own rights, but to be able to speak to them the way I do today was something I actually had to learn.
And in terms of those women's rights that you were fighting for at that stage, what were the 2 or 3 top ones that stuck out in your mind as being the most pressing?
Yeah, that was the top. There was actually 4 issues at the top that defined the reason behind the Women's March movement at that time. And they all spoke to me. The first was safety, that we don't feel safe, not just walking down the high street in the middle of the day, but it was just the safety the moment we walk out our front door, was the first perspective. The second was economic equity, in that women were not enjoying and, in fact, are disadvantaged in actually reaching economic equity for many reasons we can certainly deep dive into. But the third was representation, that we don't see ourselves in places of power, women representing across all industries only about 23% of leadership in senior leadership and board level positions. Yet we have the mandate, I'm sure as many know, from the EU that was 30%, now 40%, which is really odd because we're talking a population of about 52 to 54% of the working population, yet we're setting a target of only 40%. So I'll get off that soapbox for a moment, but I absolutely feel very strongly on that one. And the last one was really the aspect of trying to look at why that we have these issues of, women not getting the proper health care. And honestly, my daughter, who was 18 when I came out in 2016, she was an absolute brilliant educator of all of the experiences that I, at that point, had not had, but have since encountered within the medical community. And so women, like many marginalized people, do not have access to the right kinds of healthcare. So those 4 issues were the foundation that really, I went, hang on, those are my issues too, and really helped me to learn.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Any thoughts on that from anybody? Kenzie, you've come on.
Hi there. Hi,
Hiya.
Cynthia.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much. But it was just a question. I'm just curious to understand. When you were this is sort of probably going back a couple of steps now, but when you were talking about when you were fighting for women's rights,
Yeah.
I'd be keen to understand what your challenges were sort of versus someone else. Whereas in your situation, you're almost able to see a 360-degree view, if you see what I mean, given the experience that you've had to date.
Yes.
Versus maybe a woman fighting for women's rights. And I would just be keen to understand what challenges you faced and what advantages you saw, what disadvantages you saw, during that process.
Yeah, it's rather intriguing because you're right. I like to refer to I gained a superpower. I'm one leader with 2 genders worth of experience, both in the corporate C-suite, but also in life. And the reality is that I have been blessed because I had financial resources and everything else, so that I pass in today's world. So the world treats me as a woman more than it treats me as a trans person. And that's a blessing. That is a privilege that I carry, and I absolutely recognize each and every day. So in the conversation, it was to see the issues, because when I was speaking with women and we were talking about some of the various issues, and I would get a lot of, but Cynthia, that's the way it's always been. And I go, no, it isn't, because yesterday I was treated like this, and today I'm treated like this. That's not equal. And I'm able to draw it. And so one of the very early things that I used to do, and I haven't done it in years, I used to hold these really informal sessions, but not unlike this. And they used to be called 50 Years of Male Thinking in 1 hour for women, because that's all they need. And it was to take the issues that women were experiencing in their life, in the corporate space, and talk about that and bring the insights of male socialization to help them and empower them with all of that knowledge in that particular situation, so they could go back and deal with that boss or boyfriend or husband or whatever the issue was, and actually understand what motivations might be the behavior that they were experiencing that they didn't want to. As well as, of course, tactics of how to navigate through the corporate suite, because at least for the first 3 years post-transition, I was in the corporate suite as my authentic self. And so, again, I experienced the world as a woman, such as, say, being at the board table, having my seat, because I didn't lose my position by transitioning, but I did lose my voice. And I needed a male ally to actually make sure I was heard. I mean, that was like such a profound moment of, whoa, like, really? And so bringing these insights to women as we talk through each and every issue was, really where it came from. So there was always lots of questions of, how do we kind of get to the point where men are seen on this, and we have an entire system of patriarchy that very much through the last 8 years, I have learned so much about how men have to own that responsibility of changing the process, and women can be allies to men in changing that process. But we can't go redefine the patriarchy. They're living it. It both helps them, but it also penalizes them on the system. And so that was one of the early conversations Mark and I had, where I saw these kind of both sides and what we need to actually do in order to kind of address that. So that was really where it came from, Kenzie. And every situation, it's like, okay, well, let's look at this and break it down, and now start to kind of understand what are the aspects that might actually be impacting a particular given situation. And then there are issues that supersede that, such as when the realization that the conversation about the environment is probably the largest issue that impacts women. And at the end of the day, within the feminist movement, how do we bring that into the conversation? And that was at the point where we merged with Women's March International in order to actually collectively bring our voice, because it was such a big issue.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Was there any of those other points that struck anyone else differently, that kind of stood out for them?
I think that safety
Yeah.
issue, Cynthia, certainly from a male perspective here, that and particularly, we're coming up to Christmas. There's Christmas celebrations, Christmas parties going on, and the potentially the different outcomes of a Christmas party for a man and a woman.
Yeah.
What's your experience of that?
Well, I mean, there's many aspects. The first is transport. Just how do you get to an event?
Yeah.
I find that I'm okay these days being able to, say, take the tube and, go to somewhere in central London, etc. But depending upon when it's finishing up, I either want to grab it because I don't want to be on the night tube. So So at that point, then I have the extra expense, which again goes back to economic equity that's impacted by having to, take a cab home. When you're at an event, there's always this talk about, well, why, what is, quote, things that happen when something happens, why is it a woman's fault that it happened? And in doing so, it was actually one of the reasons that contributed to, in January of this year, I gave up drinking because I no longer wanted to have the liability of someone else's behavior being blamed on the fact that I was drinking to deal with it. I try not to let it affect the clothes choice that I want to wear, but I'm very conscious of it. I think it's helped a bit being a queer woman that as much as I love wearing my heels, you don't walk around London in heels for the most part. So I have gone to flats and I wear them pretty much all the time now. And that has helped again with the question of what do you do when you're trying to move about or you need to get away from someone that you're not worried about the question of, do I kick off my shoes? Do I use them as a weapon? Do I leave them behind? Do I grab them? All of those aspects that men never have to think about. And so those things changed my behavior of learning to interact in those situations. There's also looking at when you're networking. Women network very differently than men. And so figuring out kind of the right time to enter into a men's conversation versus into a conversation with a group of women, and how those are very different of the way that you come in. And that one is something that I'd say I still keep working on. And I'm part of many women's networking groups and so forth who have wonderfully brought me in and see me as a full and equal member. I don't have clearly any men's networking groups. I'm not seen as belonging to that group. And that is both a privilege to be recognized that I'm not seen as belonging to that group. But it's one of the few times where it's like, yeah, I guess I really am on the outside of that these days. But that was a no and conscious choice. So I mean, those are a few of the things that related to Christmas parties and holiday parties.
Yeah. Cynthia, that access to formal and informal networks.
Yeah.
It's a huge career barrier to women.
Yeah.
You were once part of those,
Yeah.
and now you're excluded from them.
Yeah.
What's your but actually we need to stop that. We need to break that.
Mm-hmm.
What's your advice and thoughts on
Yeah.
breaking down those barriers?
Well, it's a great question because, in developing my business here in London, I started almost with a network of no one.
Yeah.
And I'm now at the point where I actively network both in person and virtually and add about 100 targeted, valid business connections a month. And in doing so, what I found was that it's not just a reputational kind of sense. What I've done is I end up having introductions that are, if you will, very short version of stories, such as hi, I'm back in the UK and I'm looking to to rebuild my network, and I would love for you to be a part of it along with other amazing strong women. Could we connect? Kind of idea. And so it's a much softer kind of asking for permission way to come in and be able to do that, where with most men I could just hit the send with no comment. And honestly, if 50% of them had no idea that I was trans and just thought I was another woman and somehow I triggered in their mind that I might be pretty, they're going to accept the request anyway. And that's just, the harsh truth of the way men perceive that imagery. And it goes back to an alpha male culture that it looks good for them to have all of these smart, intelligent, pretty women in their network or going to lunches or whatever, which, by the way, is why in the tech sector and the medical sector, why you see a lot of the sales reps that are dealing with the clientele are these young, intelligent, pretty women getting their career start, because most of the clientele are men, and they're actually playing to that particular demographic and to that aspect of an alpha male culture where it builds credibility for him, alpha male credibility, to be seen at that table, whether she's paying for lunch or not, doesn't matter. He's seen to be out there. And yeah, so I just use that logic in reverse in the way that I network and connect with folks. So that's what I found to be different.
I'm not sure how to take the alpha male with the group of the group of women. So apologies, but we're not gonna go there. But I think it is quite interesting, actually, this male and female here, because I'm much more comfortable talking to a man and, how'd you go on the weekend? What did you do at the weekend? Did you see the football? Did you, and it's those sort of water cooler moments. It's the quick lunchtime chat. It's the which form those male bonds.
Right.
It's great to have a so, and I'm something really unpolitically about talking as from a man perspective here. It's great to be surrounded by a group of women, but at the end of the day, do we always go back to our comfort zone?
Yeah.
When it comes to real stuff, real work stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key differences. And for me, it came through the education of learning about the sisterhood, and what did it mean, and it's a connection that is not just based upon our perceived gender, but it's an emotional level connection with each other. And I'll give you a simple example where it happens. Take a look next time you step on the tube, and what I find is that when you step on the tube, for most women, they will look where other women are sitting, and we will all go sit kind of together, so that if you were to come on, you would realize, okay, well, that's where the ladies are sitting, and you could, quote, come into that space and sit there if there was an available seat, but most men will typically go sit elsewhere. And that's an unwritten bond that we share with each other. It's kind of like, you watch my back, I'll watch yours. And we're there to kind of watch over. We haven't talked, we haven't exchanged a word. We may have exchanged a casual glance, only simply to say that, like, this is an okay space. And that's something that certainly in talking to a lot of men, they don't see, they do not perceive. Much like, if you stand back and observe women walking down the sidewalk, which side of the sidewalk do they walk? Where do they typically hold their purse? All of these things are all due to safety questions. And the question of creating safety is not for women to do. That's men to do, because it's men that are actually have created the unsafe space. Not all men, but it's not a place to debate not all men. It's also not a place to debate whether men do or don't carry gender-based privilege within society, within a corporate setting. They absolutely do. And in realizing these things, and the more you become conscious of them, what I talk about making the unconscious conscious, when you do that, you all of a sudden start to actually notice these very subtle kinds of behaviors that start to come in, and they all relate to the way we were socialized. And my socialization as a woman has been rapid, but it's also been intentional, such as I used to bring together all the different kind of circles of friends that I had. It was 12 different circles of friends at one point, and I would used to invite them all together to a very casual cocktail evening. And what I would do was bring topics of the day, because I wanted to understand how women collectively looked at these issues and would talk about them and understand them. And that helped me to gain language and perception that allowed me to change the male socialization that I was raised with and that had been programmed into me into something that was much more in alignment with women, which is why when I became part of the feminist movement, it was very easy for me to start being open to growing and listening to all the other issues that I had to take on, especially when I became the board chair.
Brilliant. Any questions or observations from anyone? Bronwyn, you're so quiet today. You're off screen and you haven't said a word yet. You there?
Just maybe a question from me,
Go on,
Cynthia.
Kinsey.
Just out of interest, what is there anything that you miss sort of from your previous life?
No, because it was never my life before. In one of the presentations that I regularly deliver called One Leader, Two Genders. In there, I talk about the idea of the concept of gender identity, the way we present ourselves, sexuality, and of course, biology in the conversation. And I talk about this idea that, in my brain, the belief that during the gestational cycle, it was a different set of hormones were fired when that identity portion of my brain was created versus when my genitalia was created at a different point through the gestational process, which is why there was, quote, this mismatch. And of course, it doesn't happen all the time. We know that statistically it happens at about 0.5% of the population. So in that, I was born with a female brain, but forced, based upon genitalia, to assume all the other attributes of a male world. And so it wasn't this epiphany of, oh my gosh, I'm a woman in a man's body. It was, yeah, this body is mine. I am in my own body. It's never been the wrong body. It's just I have some birth defects that surgery can fix that can otherwise get me into alignment. Now, unfortunately, that took till I was 52, but at the end of the day, I got there. And it was at the age of 52 when I saw myself post-surgery. It was the first time I actually went, yes, that's how I've always seen myself. I had never seen myself. If you looked at my CV and you went like, well, you had a pretty impressive career as a guy and the whole bit, that was driven by two things. One was my father only acknowledged me when I did something new. I got a new accolade, I got a promotion, so on and so forth. That's when I garnered his attention. So I was constantly striving to grow and develop my career and everything else. And secondly was I had learned to do that. I had no innate sense of what it was like to be a man. So what I would do was look at men who were perceived as successful and copy their behavior. I had no idea. I just learned to copy it and really just play it out. And that's how I had learned to be that. So when I became my authentic self in 2016, it was like, oh, God, now I can rest. I just spent so much energy pretending to be a guy that I never actually was. Does that make sense, Kenzie?
Cynthia,
Yeah, it just getting my head around it, but yeah, it does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a way to get your head around it, by the way. It's called Acceptance Without Understanding. It's what the title of my first book's going to be about, and it explains the entire concept.
I think that's an important point, Cynthia. Acceptance without understanding, because I think as humans, we're programmed to want to understand the very basis of things, why people feel a certain way or why the outcome is that. We're looking for the answers, and sometimes we just have to kind of accept it and move on without that. I think that's a really, really important note, especially, you know, today, everyone is ever evolving. There are so many different kind of there's lots and lots of that we have to kind of learn, adapt and grow, so we sometimes don't need the answer.
Well, I would suggest to you that the answer is that as human beings, we are so complex that we are beyond complete understanding. And most of us don't completely understand ourselves, let alone actually feel that we can understand another human being better than they understand themselves. So when we look at kind of statistically and understand, you know, a number of aspects, and again, in the presentation, I kind of start off and I share with some facts around this. You know, if we look at and we say, okay, well, biologically, there's men and women. Yeah, but there's also intersex people. And intersex people represent 2% of the population, which, by the way, statistically is about the same percentage as people who are redhead. So we have a community of 2%, yet they're not recognized by the UK government. And if you actually go on the gender portion of the government website, such as when I was looking at transitional documentation and that, they do actually recognize and mention intersex people, but they go, we know that intersex people exist, but they must choose either male or female. So here biologically is another group of people that represent 2%. Remember, trans folks are only 0.5%, right? We're talking 2% of the population, and the government says, nah, they got to fall into one of these two boxes, and they don't fall into those boxes because they will break every one of those boxes. And so maybe the boxes are the problem. And that's when the conversation goes, okay, you're right, I don't understand. It's not our purpose in life to understand, it's our purpose in life to accept. And through acceptance, we create a safe space to have dialogue that allows us to, as I talk about, start with acceptance without understanding, create that safe space, but grow to acceptance with understanding, because now, even though we may have different points of view and different understanding, we can at least have a conversation, not to agree with each other, but to simply come to an understanding about each other.
Cynthia, historically, you go back 60 years, and society defined men and their role, and how they should behave and the things that they should be doing, and similarly they defined the women, so that the men were the breadwinners, the providers, and the women were the home builders, and the mothers and the carers. Over the years, those definitions have fallen away to a certain extent, and I would argue that probably women have become freer, or freed themselves from their stereotypes better than men have freed themselves from theirs, and maybe there's a question in that. But at what point do we get to a time when I just talk to you as Cynthia and you just talk to me as Mark, and we get to know each other on that basis, rather than through ticking some diversity boxes?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, folks that are in my industry, and as we talk about this, you know, we always talk about, we're doing this work in the hopes that one day we'll never have to do it. But we're human beings, and, you know, the reality is it's going to be constant and ongoing and evolving. I think that you can build and create workplaces and intentional corporate cultures. You can do that informally in friendships and, you know, connections, that we can just simply be Cynthia and Mark, and we don't have to wrap it up in a whole bunch. But that means we need to have some understanding of perhaps some shared values, such as the value of inclusion and what that means within our organizations or within society or within the friendship that we create, that anything that changes doesn't change the fact that we're still inclusive. And the problem is that a lot of people talk about it, very few understand it, and even less actually do it. And so that's where the work comes in, is to help folks understand it, help folks to actually do the work. And one of the biggest challenges I've found, because I did that in my corporate career, where I helped create an intentional culture, but I actually helped create an intentional culture that I didn't belong to because it wasn't inclusive. So it was through that work that I learned the importance of not only bringing diverse voices to the table to ensure that when we talk about inclusion, that we actually are creating something that is inclusive of all the voices that need to be at the table, that we want to represent. And so that's really the fundamental challenge. And it must be doable. I believe it's doable because when I look at history, and the history I look at goes back as far as 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and it came from the indigenous North American communities, and they have a word, two-spirit. And so the two-spirit community is their version. They don't use what I call the rainbow alphabet, LGBTQ+. They refer to themselves as two-spirit. And in the simplest language historically, they had 5 words that talked about this idea of gender. And it was female, male, female but male, male but female, and neither male nor female. So even in their language, the idea today of what we would call non-binary, gender non-conforming, and so were actually allowed for within their culture, and that's 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. Now, what happened from 8,000 to 10,000 years ago today? Well, colonization happened, and with that was the bringing of religion and patriarchy and so forth, which brought about the ideas that you talked about of how we understand the world today, which wasn't how the world was. And in fact, we know that to be true because there are many indigenous cultures around the world today, in over 30 different locations, that still have that kind of belief systems and understanding where those that are not necessarily binary fit into the conversation. So it's absolutely possible, but we are up against a patriarchal system that penalizes men as much as it penalizes women. We are up against belief systems that it's not my job to change someone's belief system. I can just provide information and educate, but they're taught that the belief system says that I don't exist or that my identity is not real, yet I'm very real, albeit virtual today, but very real. And so, I make them question, which is back to they need to understand in order to accept. And I'm challenging and saying, no, you need to accept that I'm a human being, not that you agree with me. And in doing so, you respect my humanity and my human rights, because we're all different. We're all going to have different needs of human rights. And when we can agree to that, we can have the dialogue to talk about our differences. But nobody's having the conversation in the middle. Everybody's very polarized these days. And I'm all about finding a conversation in the middle.
Just to your point around polarization,
Yeah.
in the UK we have a different education system, I suppose, relative to
Yes.
the rest of the world, in that that there are single-sex schools and there are co-ed schools, and obviously there's a big drive now for the single-sex schools to go co-ed. Admittedly, I think it's probably performance-driven as opposed to anything else, but but that's basically the trend.
Mhm.
And but just thinking where I'm going with the question is just trying to understand your thoughts around the male-female stereotypes, because the classic scenario is the children are in a co-ed school, and what tends to happen is, and obviously this is a generalization, but what tends to happen in the co-ed school is the boys conform more to male stereotype, the girls conform more to female stereotype.
Yeah.
You put them in a single-sex school, and in fact, all of that is taken away.
Yeah.
And you will get boys embracing subjects like drama and art and so on and so forth. In girls' schools, you'll get girls embracing rugby, football, which are traditionally sort of associated to boys.
Yeah.
Yet, in a single-sex system, it will not support any children that choose to change gender, right? Because it doesn't support that, because it is single sex.
Yeah.
And so just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and because personally I've never really understood why in a co-ed school we almost conform, the genders conform more, and in a single sex school that they don't. And I've not really ever, now I have children of my own, so I'm thinking about these things, but it wasn't really anything I thought about before. But I'd be interested to understand your thoughts and your perspective, right? Because it's at school that all these things are put in place, essentially.
Yeah. So, I mean, I started primary school in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and it was a mixed primary school, and then went to Canada. And in Canada, I only went to public school in Canada, which are all mixed. The fact is you're right, especially for girls, they outperform boys when they're in a single-sex girls-only school. And Canada, they do have them. They're mostly religiously affiliated. St. Mary's Academy, which was affiliated with the Catholic Church. And you didn't have to be Catholic to attend the school, but it was a girls-only school, and it was one of the preeminent schools for education. Some of the other schools, as you said, that were previously, say, girls' schools, were starting to, in the early years, start to mix the gender. And it was slowly, every couple of years, they would add another grade. They would just keep advancing it. I'm not an educational expert, and I know that the education that I got, and because I didn't fit the model of this fighting for the top of the mountain kind of alpha male model that it's built on, I was very much seen as, a beta male, and therefore I never fit in anywhere, which was just endless teasing and so forth. Every horrid thing you can imagine the boys might do, I've had done. I've been called out in having to fight, and I was very much always very passive person, and I never won any of the fights. I never asked for them, but was subject to them because somebody had to prove they were more manly than me through that cycle. And I can't speak to the specifics other than what I know as the history academically, where, girls have outperformed boys when they are in a single sex space. And you're right, boys, when they're in those spaces, do actually broaden the perceived male courses that they may otherwise take. I can tell you that in the mixed school, the home economics, which was cooking and other life duties course, there was a lot of guys that were in the course, but it was also an absolutely gorgeous teacher. And they wanted to be in her class. And when the boys were talking, it was not because she was such a great teacher, it's because she was so pretty. And that was the male measure, of being in that class. Yet that was not, certainly why others were there. So I don't really have a great answer to you. I mean, I waited till I was 18. My kids have never had to face it. They all went to public school. But I do see the benefit of single sex spaces. And in doing so, I also respect that with the parent support and with medical supervision, that a child may, earlier than me, figure out their identity. I talk about that, there's two keys, is you have to learn the language. Obviously, we're not born with the power of language. And then you have to find the courage to use the language. So for me, it was 48 years to learn the language, 50 years till I actually came out. I have met 6-year-old who are supported by their parents, who have medical supervision, and what I see is a beautiful young girl. And if she can benefit from going to a single-sex girls' school and so forth, then I think that would be absolutely wonderful, because what I met was a young girl. And I know that by comparing to my daughter, and I saw no difference in her. And so why can't she enjoy that same privilege as she goes through life? And we do get to the point of puberty where the conversations get a little bit more complex. At 6 years old, it's not as complex. At puberty age, it gets more complex. And so we need to talk about those things, and we need to figure out that middle ground answer. There is no black and white. And I don't have those answers. I just want to find people that want to come to the table and have those conversations so that we can figure out an answer. So I don't know if that's helpful, Kenzie, or.
No, it is helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
That's good. Nitya, you came off camera and then back on and off. Did you have a question? So.
No, it's all quite. I don't have a question as such, but it's been very, very inspiring and very interesting to hear, Cynthia, especially because, yeah, I think you are in a unique and hopefully you feel a blessed position to
Yeah.
be able to see all the sides of the coin and, you
Yeah.
know, share your insights with people like us. I just can't wait to actually speak to my friends about this discussion, frankly, and also with my husband. And I one thing that really resonated, and I was thinking about it when I just got myself a cup of tea, which is why I've been on and off camera,
Yeah.
sorry about that,
Yeah.
was the point you made about security.
Yeah.
And I'm originally from India, and I've spent I moved here 16 years ago. So I've spent like my college years and school years, and I grew up in Mumbai. And Mumbai, being relatively safe in India, was still quite a unsafe place. And even now, when I go to visit my family, I know after 10 o'clock, I'll be worried to be out of the house alone. And my parents would be worried. They would be constantly calling me, despite the fact that I travel all over the world on my own with my girlfriends, or even on my own for work.
Yeah.
So when you actually mention about safety in this country, or in a developed country, it was very, very interesting for me to hear, because for me, this is safe.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that for you, probably it isn't, because the perspectives we come from are very different. It is not, I'm not saying I'm 100% safe,
Yeah.
but I do feel safer. So that was something that I kind of want to again discuss with some of my friends with similar backgrounds. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Well, you're welcome. But I would ask you, Nettie, does this relate to your thinking? So, you know, what I had to learn was when I'm walking down the street, I have to pay attention to who might be walking towards me and kind of assessing my safety for that. Always checking over my shoulder, seeing who might be walking behind me that might be following me, looking across the street to see who might actually be trying to cross the street to make a directional change to come towards me. I'm assessing the street. Where are the exits on the street? Thankfully, in London, as I said, I wear flats. I don't wear my heels. But when I did wear heels in North America, it was, do I kick them off? Do I pick them up and use them as a weapon? What is my strategy? Well, I can tell you that whole conversation, men never think about. Forget the heels part. Men never think about those questions. And I guess the question I have for you is, do you ever think of those questions related to your safety today?
I do, but much rarely than I was before.
Yeah.
I definitely do.
Right. Yeah.
I think on that point, Cynthia, as well, like for me, there are definitely conscious things that I do. I don't know, for example, you think, oh, wearing something, if you're thinking of something to wear, and because as irritating as it is, and I think that they're even trying to get laws against like catcalling and things like that, you're just thinking, oh, can I be bothered with the hassle of, you know, people commenting or looking or so for me, there are definite conscious things that I would do before I leave the house, or if I know I'm going on public transport on my own, perhaps put my lipstick on whilst I'm there rather than before I leave the house. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think that a lot of men, for example, would have to think about those things before they leave the house. So I do understand what you're saying.
Yeah. And that's what I mean when I talk about safety, is in a man's world, those are questions they never think about.
Well, I think some of the younger generation, and I'm speaking with, a mother of two teenagers. I have a boy, I have a girl, and my son is 19. And I do think there is some hope coming through. My son is so much more aware of his privilege. And whereas I've got my husband and I still, obviously, you say we were brought up with these differences and it hasn't gone away. But the one thing is that gives me a little bit of hope is, my son knows very well that if he's walking down the road and there's somebody in front of him, he'll cross over to the other side. Is aware that it makes them feel unsafe. And I think that's something that I think the younger generation are becoming a little bit more aware. But my daughter was catcalled. She was 12 and in school uniform. And it's just that's the depressing thing. So it doesn't actually, there are some people, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. And in fact, the bad characters, that's never the reason.
Absolutely.
But you're right, it's very much my son goes out wearing whatever he wants, but also I do believe that his generation is a lot more supportive of girls should be able to wear what they want. And I think they're more aware of it. I think I'm just sort of I said to Mark earlier on, I'm feeling quite depressed about it all, that we're still having these conversations, but I think there was a little bit of progress with the next generation.
I do agree.
Absolutely, Bronwyn. And that's why when people ask me who are my heroes, it's the youth, because they get a lot of this and they're doing things just like your son. They are much more aware and they are much more in touch with kind of each other, that they are starting to change these aspects that we were socialized under into something that is much more equitable for all of us to coexist with.